Welcome everyone to this month's Exploring Quality in Family Childcare. Today we are going to be talking about the infants in your program and supporting their gross motor development. We have a guest speaker today. Her name is Gretchen Becker-Crabb, and I will let her introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Grace. Hello, everybody. So wonderful to be here today. I am here to talk about supporting infant large motor development. This is such a big topic, and we are likely going to scratch the surface of motor development today. But I would love to hear all of your ideas and thoughts about what you do in your centers, and of course, I'll offer you some of my ideas as well. A little bit about myself. I am a occupational therapist. I'm a licensed professional counselor, a certified lactation counselor, as well as a endorsed infant mental health therapist. And I actually got my start in early childhood. I was an infant toddler room teacher, and have always loved kids and babies, and my joy of being in classrooms and being with children just grew from there. Um, Currently in my position, I own and operate my own business in Madison. I see some private clients, individual clients. I am mentor faculty for the University of Wisconsin-Madison Infant Early Childhood and Family Mental Health Capstone Program. But I think one of my most favorite jobs I get to do right now is I am an infant mental health consultant with Reach Dane, as well as UW preschools as well. So preschools are my jam. Babies are my thing, and I'm just so honored to be here with you all today. Okay, so let's get started here. So our objectives today is we're going to go over infant and gross motor development. We're going to talk a lot. We're going to really kind of try to specifically focus on floor play, or tummy time in infant development. And then we're going to talk and hopefully engage with each other as well around strategies that we can use in the classroom and with kids as well. Okay, but to get started, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about some of the foundational skills of infant development. And these, I don't think, these are really important, and I don't think that they get enough credit for the importance that they hold in our development. And those are primitive reflexes. Again, there's 18 primitive reflexes, and out of these 18 primitive reflexes, we're going to talk about 3 today. Those 3, I think, have the most impact on tummy time and on gross motor development. So that's why we'll focus on those 3 today. Know again that is just scratching the surface, but they're so very important and really truly set the stage for infant development. In utero, babies assume this physiological flexion position. And this physiological flexion is really important because it helps to, as humans, we have to be birthed out of the birthing canal, and we need to be able to take up as little surface area as possible while in the womb. And so babies will assume this physiological flexion, and their goal after they're born is to start to move out of this. Outside of the womb, they have to deal with gravity and different environments and being held in different ways. And so one of their primary goals is to move out of this physiological flexion position. One of the reflexes that assist us in this is called the tonic labyrinthine reflex, or it's known as TLR. And that's what you'll hear me reference it at, because saying tonic labyrinthine reflex many times is difficult to do. Anyway, so TLR. TLR is responsible for helping with muscle tone and motor development of the child. So when babies flex their heads from birth to about 4 years of age or 4 months of age, their whole entire body flexes with them. If they extend their heads, their whole entire body extends as a result. This reflex is really important. We hopefully will see it in infants. It is integrated, meaning we usually don't see that reflex happen in that way, or it grows into a more complicated reflex at around 4 to 6 months of age. So that's the flexion part. The extension part is usually fully integrated at about 3 years. So this is a really important reflex that is stimulated by the vestibular system. So movement of the head activates this reflex. With an integrated TLR, what we notice is this helps to balance out muscle tone, like I said before. As you can imagine, it helps to move babies out of that physiological flexion position. It also helps with the birthing process because it's one of the reflexes, along with crawling, that helps the baby to kind of wiggle their way out of the birth canal. It helps the baby to develop this balance between flexion and extension. As you can imagine, if we didn't have the opportunity to work through this, things like walking or sitting would become really difficult because as soon as we moved our heads, we would start to go into that position. So we want this really gentle balance between flexion and extension to be able to maintain more upright positions. Interestingly enough, when I see children who have not integrated this TLR reflex, oftentimes it's evident in things like these are children who tend to get car sick really easily and or toe walk because they can't find that balance between flexion and extension. It also aids in the development of proprioceptive input, which is the information that we receive through our muscles and our joints that tell us where we are in space. So this reflex helps to really reinforce that in the body. It also aids in visual tracking and eye convergence. So especially vertical um, visual tracking, so looking up and down. And it also aids in eye convergence. So this becomes really important down the line. Well, even if we're thinking like kindergarten, this becomes really important with reading skills, right? To be able to hold your eyes on a small, on a focused area, and then to be able to look out into the world and look more at a larger scale. We call that convergence and divergence. So when a baby is in TLR, when they flex their heads, they're able to convert their eyes. When they look out into the world, they're more able to diverge their eyes. So again, when I see children who haven't quite been able to integrate this reflex down the line, we see difficulties with fine motor skills. We might see challenges in reading, those types of activities, copying from the board, those types of activities. And it all happens in utero. The next reflex that I'll talk about is the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, or ATNR. So this reflex, basically what happens with this reflex is if an infant from birth to about 6 months of age turns their head to one side, they're going to assume this fencer position, it's called. So they flex their leg on the opposite side that their head is turned to, and arm, and then they extend their arm in the direction that they're looking in. And the same thing happens if they go to the other side. This reflex is really important. It emerges at about 18 weeks in utero, but what this reflex does for the baby during the birth process is it helps the baby to actually work its shoulders out of the birth canal. That's why it's present at birth. And it's integrated about 6 months after birth, about the time where children start independently sitting, because it would be really disruptive if you turned your head and you automatically went in this position. Babies are going to have a hard time sitting at that point if the ATNR is still turned on. The importance of the ATNR reflex are that they're the beginnings of cross-lateral movement. So that's the ability for us to be able to do one thing with one side of our body and another thing with the other side of our body. It also aids with airway clearing in a prone position, so on their tummies. It helps them to turn their head and move their shoulders in a way that helps to clear their airway. Um, it aids with hand-eye coordination. So this is the first opportunity that babies have to develop that, where they will turn their head, their arm is out to the side, and it helps to give them an idea of, oh, my hand is really important because my eyes are drawn to it. But it also helps them if they hold on to something and they start to develop this, or even if they're not holding on to something, it helps them to see how far their eyes are from their hand. It also, because of that, aids them in boundaries. So it's their first opportunity to kind of be like, how much space do I take up in the world? Where do I begin and end, and where does the rest of the world begin and end? It also aids in auditory processing. So if they are turning their heads to either side and they hear a sound, they're able to orient and figure out how close or far away that sound is from them. And then the last reflex we're going to go over, again, remember that there's 18 of them. So we are just getting to a few of them, is crawling. And so babies, I think this is just fascinating. Babies from the time that they're born can crawl. And it's basically moving their legs, right, back and forth in a coordinated manner. This develops at about 12 weeks in utero, again, aids with the birth process, and is fully integrated at about 4 months of age. So oftentimes I see parents who are like, oh, my baby is whatever, 2 weeks old, and look at that, they're crawling. And how effective is, how awesome is that? Normally we would see that at about 12 months of age. And and it is very important, and it sets the beginnings of more mature crawling, but it's fully integrated at about 4 months of age. So they'll notice the crawling and then they'll stop, which sometimes worries parents. But if you can assure them that that crawling integration is what we want to see, then it can be reassuring. Um, Fascinating, if you've ever heard of the breast crawl, this is a fascinating phenomenon that if a baby is born, typically an unmedicated birth, more of a typical delivery. When the baby is born, if you put the baby on the parent's belly or chest, the baby will actually crawl their way up to the areola and latch and start feeding. They sometimes need a little bit help in doing that, but that's why they do that. The crawling motion also helps them to support their jaw, so it actually also assists with feeding. So if a baby is fed ventral to ventral, we call it, or tummy to tummy, they actually can use that crawling reflex to help them coordinate their oral motor control. It's fascinating. Um, Obviously, this also aids with bilateral coordination and activation of both sides of the brain. So we're activating the brain in different ways. The right side of the brain will control the left side of the body, and the left side of the brain will control the right. So it helps to activate and coordinate the brain as well. Okay, so I'm going to show you, just to prove my point, how you can see these movements in utero. So I'm going to play this video. And you can see here a little bit of that TLR happening. So you notice the baby flexing and extending as they turn their head. You can see that their body shifts. And then you can see a little bit of the crawling coming up right here where the baby's going to extend their legs a little bit and start to flex and extend. And that is a really quick example of how you can see some of those movements in utero. I'll show you one more time because it goes so quickly. But just so you know, like if you can see these things already happening in utero, they're so important to the development of the baby, of the birth process, as well as the gross, they really provide the foundation of gross motor skill development. I love watching them flex and extend their legs there. Okay, and then the next video that I'm going to show you, and this one is courtesy of Suzanne Collison in her videos around biological nurturing. But I'm going to show you what some of these reflexes do. Again, this goes fairly quick. When a baby is feeding, because again, this is like the occupation of a baby. Babies need to sleep and they need to eat and they need to poop and they need to play and feel loved. But this is a great example, I think, of how some of those reflexes play out just even in a feed. And I'll try to dictate here as we talk, as we watch. So you can see that this baby is, their head is turned to one side. There's a little bit more extension on one side. You can see that that was a rooting reflex that happened there. You can see a little bit of the crawling here. And as the baby starts bopping his head, you can kind of notice how the back starts to straighten out a little bit. And the more that the baby tries to push and use their feet, they're usually better able to find that latch. So again, you can see those feet moving, the head bopping up and down, that flexion extension that happens with that, and then the baby's able to latch. So everything in that babies do, especially from that 0 to 4 month phase, a lot of it is reflexive, but it all matters. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about gross motor development from about 0 to 12 months. I'm going to show you, I'm going to kind of go quickly through the first 0 to 4 months because we're going to talk more in detail about tummy time, and we'll save some of those details from the 0 to 5 month phase a little bit further on in our presentation. I should pause there and ask if anybody has any questions or comments. I know I went through the reflex super quick, but any questions or comments about the reflexes? And I can't see the chat right now. So Grace, if you wouldn't mind, just if there are any questions or comments, if you wouldn't just mind just calling them out.
Yes, I will do that. If you have a question or comment, please put those in the chat, and I will be the voice of the chat today.
Okay, thank you.
Kelly says, very interesting.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, fantastic. All right, so let's move on then. And again, if you have an idea or a question, please feel free to put it in the chat at any time. The one thing that I will say about motor development is I think as an occupational therapist, one of the things that I've learned is that it's really not about, is the baby able to roll or sit or stand or walk? As much as it is about the quality of the movement and transitional movements. So the quality of movement actually tells me more about the gross motor skills of an infant than if they can just sit or stand or whatnot. Because as you can imagine, if a baby is struggling with transitioning into and out of sitting, but they can sit upright, that's going to be a source of a lot of frustration for the infant. It also tells me that that them moving or having like rotational movement might be somehow impaired. So, and that is really where our postural control comes from, where our balance comes from, our abilities to be able to move throughout the world are based off of some of these transitional movements. So as much as we're going to talk about some of the milestones, I really would love you to be thinking about what happens in between the milestones, because that's where the magic happens. That's where we can really make a difference in helping children in their motor development.
One question.
Yes.
What happened? What happened if one of my children skip the whirling stage?
Could you say that one more time?
What happened if one of my children skip the crawling stage?
So if they skipped one of the stages?
Yes.
Yes. So that we'll talk about that. I think that I think it depends on what stage it is. And it also depends on if they have some of these other in-between types of skills. So sometimes if I see a child, for example, if I see a kiddo go from sitting to, let's say, like walking, like, and they skip the crawling phase, let's say, and they go straight from sitting to just standing or cruising. It would really depend on if that child has some of the other postural skills, because a lot of there's a lot of nuances in the stages that happen that that have impacts on development later on. So we would never like I would never force a kid to go through the crawling phase or anything like that. But I do think that sometimes there's like shoulder stability that's lost, or unless that child is able to show those skills in different ways. So it does matter, but it's not something we would necessarily force a child to do either. One of the other things that I think about with that question is is the is again the quality of the movement. So oftentimes I see kids who go from maybe they skip the crawling phase, go to the standing phase, and go to walking, for example. But when they start walking, they can only walk super quickly in one direction, and then they fall over and they need somebody else to pick them up, and then they go again. And they're quote walking, but the quality of their transitions with the walking isn't quite there. Then we might want to encourage going back to, oh, let's crawl through the tunnel, or let's do other activities that might help build some of those in between types of skills. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Hopefully you'll get some other examples and ideas as we go on here too.
That was very helpful. I was gonna ask that, but thanks for answering it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. And again, as we go through some of these stages here, hopefully it'll also give you some ideas of what you can do with infants in those in-between types of periods and what we're looking for. Um, okay, so again, at 0 to 3 months, the baby's job is really to practice lifting that head against gravity. There's a lot of active reflexes that are happening, and they're really using those to navigate their environment. Um, Usually at 0 to 3 months, babies will also do things like they'll lay on their back and they'll kick, or they'll start to bring their hand to their mouths. They'll start to open and shut their hand. That's another reflex. If you take your finger and you put it inside of a baby's palm, they'll usually automatically close their hands around that. And so really their job is really at this stage is to navigate an extrauterine environment, start playing with gravity basically, and starting to figure out how to move in different ways against that gravity. Again, we're going to go over this more extensively, so just hold that in mind. We'll also continue to go over the 4 to 6 month phase in tummy time, but in about 4 to 6 months, we're going to start to notice that the baby's going to start putting their hands in a prone position. They're either tucking them underneath them or starting to get up like this picture, like you would see in this picture, where their arms are more they're bearing more weight on their forearms than just kind of on their heads. The baby will also begin rolling. Now, I'm going to say this about rolling as well. There's a reflex with rolling where if an infant turns their head too quick, it's also integrated into that ATNR reflex. If an infant turns their head too quick, they're going to roll. So again, I've seen this a lot too, where parents are like, oh my gosh, my baby's 1 month old and they're already rolling. That's awesome. Yes, that's what they're doing. But that's rolling that's more stimulated by a head movement. It's more of a reflex. When I'm talking about rolling here at 4 to 6 months, I'm talking about segmented rolling that starts at the hips and the legs. It's very different, and it's a different quality than you might notice with a baby who turns their head quickly and just the rest of their body rolls along with them. One of the best tricks that I have for helping to facilitate rolling is to lay the baby in a blanket on the floor or on a harder surface and just lift the side of the blanket up. And usually the baby then, if they're in this like segmented rolling phase, it'll usually help them to learn how to facilitate with their hips more so than with their head. So that's a really important piece to notice in the rolling. Again, that's one of those quality details that we look at. Even if that baby is going from like on their back to like a sideline position, sometimes I just do that with the blanket, and that might be enough for the baby in that position. But it can also help to facilitate more of that like controlled rolling onto their bellies. At 4 to 6 months, we also notice supportive sitting. So that's the baby sitting, supporting themselves with their hands, or they might need like a boppy pillow around them or something like that in order to aid with their sitting. They're not quite able to do it independently yet. For this phase, I really recommend using a boppy pillow versus something like the Bumble chair, if you've ever heard of that, where it really like it's a chair that kind of comes up and it supports them up into their mid trunk. And the reason why I do that, and the reason why I recommend a boppy, is because sometimes what happens with those Bumble chairs is it puts the baby's legs into an abducted position. So it kind of like it rolls their hip joints out. And so when they go from sitting in the Bumble that's really supported and their hips out, they don't get as much work in their hip flexors as we would like them to, and they're kind of stuck more in more of a static or a stuck position than having the ability to be able to kind of move and fall back and practice some of those movements that they need at their hips. If you don't have a boppy pillow, like blankets or things like that, but we just want the babies to be able to have freedom of movement in their hip areas. Okay, I'll say that again. We'll talk more about tummy time here in a moment. So hold on that one. At about 7 to 9 months, we notice babies have the ability, for the most part, to sit independently. I will also say this, which I should have said, about 5 slides earlier, is that gross motor development is variable. To me, it doesn't really matter quite as much as if like babies are hitting these milestones according to the months, as long as they're hitting milestones as they progress. So if babies get stuck in a phase, like they're in a seated, they've worked their way to sitting, but they're not able to then transition from sitting to like their bellies, or they're stuck in sitting, like they feel they're really uncomfortable and they can't kind of like turn to reach something. Those would be, and they kind of get stuck there. That to me is more concerning versus like watching an infant grow and develop out of that, even if that takes them 2 extra months to be able to develop that skill. But if they continue to develop, then that's less of a concern to me than it is for them to be like, oh, it's 9 months, they should be sitting. There's a lot of variation in these like guidelines. So again, 7 to 9 months, baby is sitting independently, but I will also say that baby starts to be able to go from that independent sitting position to either their bellies or to like this, like hands and knees, like this cutie here on the left here, to this 4-point position. So this position where they will either go onto their bellies or they'll assume this 4-point. And in that position, we usually see them starting to rock on their hands and knees. They might start army crawling, where they're flat on the ground and they're just kind of like moving their arms and their legs back and forth through to get to something, or even pivoting on their belly. But we want to see babies be able to like pivot on their belly, pause, and then pop back up into that seated position, and then move into and out of that as well. Some of the things that I like to do in this phase of development is really to promote lots of different textures, to promote different things that babies are looking at. Let's say if they are sitting, that like we're putting toys and things like that to the left and the right and behind them, so that they're not just always moving front to back in this more like lateral plane. We're really trying to work on them moving in a variety of directions. So think variety at this phase. And cause and effect types of things. As I'm sure most of you know, this is usually the phase where babies like to when they're eating and they like to take their food and drop it off of the side of their trays and like watch you go pick it up. Like they have this cause and effect happening. And so cause and effect toys or things that they can throw are really helpful to encourage some of the development around this phase. Okay, I'm going to show you a quick video on some of the stages of crawling so you can see, and I can call out for you some of these nuances in the transitions. Again, this video I found on YouTube, but from a YouTube handle called Mama Natural, who gave me permission to show you this today. So many thanks to her. But I'm going to show you some of these stages of crawling that we look at. And hopefully what you can see here is notice some of the transitional phases that the baby goes through. Baby goes to a full plank position, right? And you can see how much more they're using their arms and their shoulder girdles. Now the baby starts to get their legs underneath them, right? And you can see how dynamic the movement is here. Ooh, almost to sitting. Oh, not quite. And then the pivoting, so important to this, because especially we want to see them pivoting from one side to another, making sure that they're doing both sides. Now you start to see the arms and the legs get involved. Again, that bilateral, that cross-lateral movement. And there's a lot of in-betweens. My guess is that this baby is struggling because she has socks on. Barefoot is best, I would say, whenever you're working on some of these gross motor activities, and hard in Wisconsin winters. You can see, oh, look at that, like, right? We have propped up on arms, and now we're seeing some of that crawling. You can also notice that there's good bilateral use of her legs. Not that it's always perfect. So our arms and legs are both moving in a coordinated manner to get to that keyboard. And in the end, this is what that looks like. Okay. So again, I hope that you see that there is a lot of variation, but what I will also say too is that sometimes babies will go through this phase of like, they'll start crawling and they like leave a leg behind. So, you know, they scoot in an interesting way, or they only will pull on one side of their bodies to go, which is typical when they start to go into a new phase. But if it always happens that way, then we like to see some we like to really see both sides of the body used in a coordinated way. So I would even say, even if a baby decides to like pull with their right arm and push with their right leg, and then they have to switch to the other side, that will usually turn into something that's more coordinated than I can only use one side of my body. As you can imagine, the strength balance or imbalance that will happen with something like that could be more significant for them in hip and leg and shoulder girdle development, which will sometimes impact development down the line. Sometimes kids just have funky patterns, but if their patterns are impacting some of these transitions, then we really want to watch for that. At about 10 to 12 months, now we notice more advanced crawling skills. We notice pull to stand, kneeling, so important. Play in kneeling. So especially for those babies who decide to skip the crawling phase, playing in a kneeling position can be so helpful. One of my favorite things to do is take like those, I have a picture of it later on in this presentation, is like the nuggets. They're like foam or padded furniture that you can stack up and kids can build into forts, or you can do lots of different things with them, is to stack some of those and put toys on there. And so like, even if the babies fall, there's not very far for them to fall, but they can practice playing and kneeling on their bottoms. That would be the first phase. And then when they go into like more of a long kneel position, that's another phase that they can play in. A half kneel position, so they're half kneeling, with one leg, and then the other leg is more extended. So one leg is flexed, one leg is extended, and then you switch, and then they finally get to pull to stand. So there are all those little nuances that you can play in, and all those little levels that you can play in to help their bodies to develop that skill. And then finally, and then cruising. Usually we see assisted standing or standing before we see walking. And I like to watch for independent standing before walking, if possible, Or if babies start to just take off and they start walking, then I usually like to go back to independent standing with them if I'm able. For this reason, is that usually if we see babies just like taking off and going, it usually means that they have decreased postural control, or it could mean that. The adult version of this would be if we all met at like Lake Wingra and I brought a log for all of us to walk across. My guess is that unless you're a very skilled log roller, you would probably run across that log as fast as you could, right? Very few of us would take our time and go really slowly. That's because we don't have the postural control to be able to stand upright. And so we tend to go quicker because it elicits more postural control. If babies don't practice independent standing, then they're just going with momentum instead of using their abdominal muscles and their back muscles and their hip muscles to keep them in place. So that becomes a really important part of development as well. And then cruising, so being able to hold on to things and move in that way. So I'm going to show you one more video here of what that progression looks like in stand. Okay, so we have the crawling phase here. And then you'll see this very brief like pull to stand, but you see that's a half kneel. And then she finally comes up to a full stand. This is what I'm talking about with standing in standing independently. I would also say that it's important to notice that they're holding on to her shoulders and not her hands. Holding on at the shoulders is so important because if we hold on to the hands while baby is trying to walk, we have the opportunity to dislocate a ligament in their elbows. So holding and giving them more support at the hips or the knees initially is very helpful. And then as they develop control, then they can do things like this, where they're holding onto something with their hands and gaining the stability that way. Now this baby is 10 months in walking, right? But you can see how she has also gone through all of these other stages of the crawling and of development. So, and she's navigating this quite slowly. She's not running through the walk. She's really taking her time finding her balance and finding her postural control in it. Right? She's able to recover and do that transitional movement. Sometimes for kids who haven't crawled, they struggle more with that. And then we finally have walking. Hooray!
We have one question about this
Yes.
in the chat. I have a 16-month-old not walking yet. Is that concerning? He is holding onto things and walking along things.
I think that's actually perfect. And thank you for that beautiful transition to this next slide, because 12 to 18 months is usually when we look at walking. I feel like a lot of times if babies aren't walking at 12 months, people become really concerned. It's not 12 months. It's actually, for most kids, it's closer to 18 months when we actually start to see them start to cruise and walk and take some more independent steps. Beyond 18 months, again, a baby could be up to 20 months and not walking, but if they're showing you all of these other developmental skills, it's not quite as concerning. If they're missed a lot of these steps and they're still having a hard time walking at 18 months, then I would be more likely to call birth to 3 or have them, or an occupational therapist or a physical therapist, and have them assessed for their skills. But at 16 months, and a 16-month-old who's cruising furniture and is practicing this kneeling and standing and all that stuff is right on track. Great question. And then we start noticing some of these other skills like running or crawling upstairs, really when they start to become more dangerous for themselves, is usually what we start seeing at about this phase. Okay, so we'll go into tummy time next. Are there any other questions that have popped up around development just in general, or any other questions? All right. Okay. We'll get back to, let me try to get back to my screen here. Okay, tummy time. So the age-old question, how much tummy time should a baby have? So the American of Pediatrics says that play and interact with your baby while they're awake and on their tummy 2 to 3 times each day for a short time, 3 to 5 minutes. You can start the day your baby gets home from the hospital. I think that this can be really interesting because I would never expect a baby who is just home from the hospital to really maintain tummy time for 3 to 5 minutes. Actually, well, I would. I could. But if a baby can't tolerate 3 to 5 minutes, we're talking 3 to 5 minutes and working up to that. So even if a baby is on their tummy and they're happy and they're content for 50 seconds, that counts, right? So we would never encourage a baby or make a baby work through to 5 minutes because that's what's recommended. The most important thing about tummy time is that babies are feeling content, that their environment is supportive, and they feel like they are, and it's an enjoyable time for them. As babies get older and stronger, they need more time on their tummies to help build their strength. I think as we just saw in that progression, if a baby is never on their tummy, it's going to be really difficult for them to establish that really great postural control that those the legs, the upper shoulders and the arms in the way that we would like to see them build their skills on. It's very foundational. Tummy time prepares babies for being able to slide on their bellies and crawl, as we just saw, working up to 50 to 30 to, I would even say, by 7 weeks, and then continuing that beyond that time. Working in bits and pieces to get to some of these goals is okay. And if a baby isn't able to tolerate, again, if a baby isn't able to tolerate their tummies for very long at all, then we're going to be really creative around different positions that we can use to help support them so that they're still in that tummy position, but maybe they're just not on the floor.
I do have a question about
Yes.
that, Gretchen. That last slide in the
Yeah.
chat, Sarah is asking what age at which this has been set for this recommendation.
For tummy time,
From
it
working
starts,
up to the 2 to 3 minutes or the 15 to 30 minutes.
yes, so 15 to 30 minutes each day by 7 weeks of development, and then the 3 to 5 minutes is in the first couple of months of life or weeks of life. Sorry.
Thank you.
Sure. Excellent. And again, I think that this is another one of those areas where quality matters more. The references are great guidelines, but we're going to talk more about why it's important and what are some of the things that get in the way of that, and maybe help to dispel some of the myths that happen around tummy time. So tummy time, it's a great time for social emotional development. So really, if a baby is on their tummies, hopefully somebody is with them and active with them and talking to them and engaging them. It aids in sensory exploration and regulation and integration. So it gives babies these opportunities to be able to see the world in a different way. It helps with oral motor development. I'm going to get to that in the next slide, so hold on to that for a moment because it doesn't always seem connected. It is absolutely connected to oral motor development. Again, postural control, as we've talked about, hand-eye coordination, as we've talked about, shoulder stability and hand development. What you're able to do at your hands starts in your shoulders. So if a baby is always lying on their backs, they don't have that ability to work against gravity for their shoulders, and it has a significant impact at their hands. And neck stability. Again, thinking about that physiological flexion position, they need to be able to work out of that. And so tummy time gives them the ability to be able to work more that neck against gravity. This is, I love this picture. This is a picture of fascial lines in your body. This I got from the book Anatomy Trains. And fascia is this like clear iridescent layer of connective tissue that covers your muscles. And as you can see here, these two fascia lines, you have a major one that goes from your back, from the top of your head all the way down to your toes on the back, and then from your jaw all the way down to your toes again in the front. If you can imagine, these fascia lines are worked as the baby is on their tummy and in that flexion extension position. So if a baby doesn't really have a lot of good quality tummy time, what happens is those flexor fascia take over and the extensor fascia don't have as much opportunity to get worked out. The extensor fascia especially, as you can see, the flexor have direct ties to our jaw. And so working tummy time helps the babies to move out of just a suckling pattern into more complex feeding movement patterns. Why might tummy time be challenging? So muscle tone, so hypo or hypertonicity. If you have a baby where you're holding them and they feel like you're holding on to jello, or you need like 4 hands to hold them, sometimes that can be a sign of hypotonicity or lack of muscle tone. Hypertonicity is the opposite of that, where sometimes you hold babies and it feels like they never really nuzzle in, or they feel like you're holding a board. That is more of that hypertonicity. So that can oftentimes get in the way of babies working through tummy time. Torticollis, which is a shortening of the sternocleidoid mastoid muscle on either side of the neck. So a baby kind of tends to hold their head in this or one or a variety of positions. Can be difficult and can make tummy time difficult. Though for these two things, tummy time can also be a way to help facilitate moving out of those, moving through some of those conditions. Every baby is going to have preferences outside of the womb. So once they're born, they're going to have more preferences to one side based off of the way that they were positioned in the womb. But tummy time helps them to work out of those preference positions and helps to balance it out. Sensory processing differences. So sometimes I have babies who don't like to be on their tummies because they don't like the feel of it, or because they have vestibular processing difficulties. So moving them in different positions becomes really overstimulating for them. So that might make it a challenge. The environment. So sometimes babies are really challenged by if they don't feel like they're safe. If the environment isn't like super inviting, sometimes being in that position can feel really vulnerable to babies because they're not always able to move out of that position. Containers. Oof, we could probably spend a whole nother 2 hours together, you guys, like just on containers. But we live in a society that that is more individualistic. So I think about parents who are, who have a baby and don't have a lot of social support, and a parent who just has to take a shower and make sure that that baby is safe. And usually babies are put into containers for that reason, or car seats, right? Like, yes, it's important for safety, but oftentimes babies will spend too much time in there. And so what happens then is that babies don't have really, if you compare that to something like wearing a baby, like in a sling or something like that, if you can imagine that, babies get all this different vestibular information. They're up, they're down, they're left, they're right, they're moving in circles, versus if they're like just in a boppy seat or something like that, they only move in one way. And so really sometimes tummy time can be more challenging in individualistic cultures because babies spend more time in containers and allow for less movement and less dynamic movement. Reflux, I don't have that on here. Reflux can also be a challenge, but and parents worry about babies spitting up, especially if they're chronic spitter uppers. But sometimes what I do is I work with families and work with their schedules and timing of feeds, because actually reflux does not make tummy time worse. If anything, lack of tummy time can make reflux work worse because they don't have the ability to work with some of the sphincters that they need in order to keep the liquid down. And then the last one that I'll talk about. Oh,
one question.
yes.
Uh, There is a specific time in which the baby must be face down.
Yeah, so there's a variety of time. I think as often as possible, given that a lot of times babies spend time in, in containers, I think, or on their backs because of back to sleep. So usually what we recommend is any time during waking periods is facilitating tummy time would be excellent. Um, and also and we'll talk about the variety of ways that we can do that, because it doesn't just mean that the baby is on the floor during that time. So it can really vary. And we're also watching the baby and their responses. That's probably the most important part. So if a baby really gets upset with tummy time, doing it in shorter amounts and working them slowly through from their tummies to their backs or their tummies to being held can also make a significant difference. So it's going to vary, but usually what we recommend is during waking times that we would like to see them on their tummies. And part of that too is because of back to sleep, because babies spend so much time on their backs when they're sleeping, is that when they are awake, as often as we can, getting them in that tummy position is usually best.
Gretchen, I wanted to let you know we just have a few more minutes left, and Tracy asked a question in the chat that I think you'll probably touch on, but I just want to read it out loud. So, are toys on the floor at tummy time good to have on the floor? Does that help with anything as far as crawling?
Yes. Oh, we're going to talk about that right now. So when we look at tummy time progression, and some of the toys that we might want to consider, the first and foremost toy is you. Or the thing I love and I super appreciate about mixed age environments is other kids, because they are the motivators for babies. Babies are drawn to human faces. They're drawn to interaction. And so that is usually the best toy that we can give them. Having said that, there's other things that we can do to facilitate. So a baby at 0 to 3 months is really going to be like keeping their head in contact with the floor. And so what babies do is they'll at birth, their hips tend to be more in this like an inverted V position. And then usually by like about 7 weeks, they work themselves into more of like a extended position. So you can see it here. The baby on the far left at 0 to 3 months, there's that little bit of flexion in their hips. But if you look at a baby at about 7 months, they start to have more of this like more of a stretched out position to their movement. So they start in that like with their head on the ground, and then their point of control, I call it like a key point of control, or the area where we're focusing on starts at the head, moves to the neck, moves to the hips, and then moves to crawling, right? The hands and knees. So we want to practice with babies and meet them where they're at. So like at 3 to 5 months, if we're really trying to encourage this, like more of that head extension, more of that expansion through the chest, we want to have the baby either on the floor or on the parent or on you, like laying on you, or even another child if they're able to tolerate that. Or holding them, if you're holding them, instead of holding them up by your shoulder, holding them in this prone position, like this I can show you with my little baby here, holding them like this in a prone position. And you can alter that so that if they don't have a lot of head and neck extension, you can kind of put them more upright, right? As they develop more, you can kind of spread your hands out and hold them in this way. They don't have to be on the floor. You could put them over a ball or even lay on the ball, and like you lay on the ball and they're laying on you in that way. If they are on the floor, taking either an inverted ramp or a rolled up towel that you could put underneath their shoulders or a boppy pillow, and that gives them a little bit more to work off of. As you can see in this picture at 5 to 7 months, then you see the baby start to extend, but the baby is still having fun looking at dad here, but is really starting to move from the point of control at the head back to the knee. 7 to 10 months, you're going to start to notice more of like a flying posture. The baby's going to look like they're flying. And then at 7 to 10 months, you're going to notice crawling. Again, I think that thinking about tummy time instead of floor time is important because there are cultural considerations. There are some cultures that do not want babies put on the floor. And being creative about where you're putting babies, I think is important, having conversations with with families. You're always balancing the sensory input. So we're moving babies very slowly and very intentionally from every position that you have them in. And we're just being really mindful about that. Some of the equipment that I use, if it's not me, again, first and foremost, use yourself, use humans as equipment. But a small playground ball or a therapy ball can sometimes be helpful. I love these nugget couches because they're great for the older kids, but for babies, we can put them on varying inclines that matches best where the baby is at. Like little stacking toys where other kids can stack and the baby can look up and then other kids can knock it over. Mirrors are great, and anything that involves visual tracking. And then again, in mixed age environments, I think involving everybody in tummy time is so important because, again, human faces are the most motivating. You can sometimes use visually defined spaces. So if you have older children, putting down a big blanket for the baby, if the baby is on the floor, and defining that space for the kids, like that's an area where they crawl in instead of walk in maybe. And then integrating tummy time into typical routines. So one of my favorite things to do is after every diaper change, offer some tummy time. You're on a surface anyway, right? Like encouraging tummy time after every diaper change. Or thinking about if you're holding and you're bringing the baby to feeding or you're preparing the bottle, have them on their bellies instead of holding them upright. Playing with bubbles is really exciting, or sitting in sideline, rocking, playing, singing. All of those things can really invite more interest in tummy time. So use the kids in the environment. I actually prefer mixed stage environments over like infant classrooms because of this reason when we're considering gross motor skills and tummy time as well.